According to the four Gospels, a council of religious leaders had Jesus arrested here among the olive trees of Gethsemane. In the hours that followed, the same writers agree that Jesus was interrogated, accused, and physically beaten. But did the events of Jesus' examination really happen as the New Testament says? This group of scholars says that the case for the Gospel's description of that night is compelling. For the past 10 years, they've been weighing the historical evidence for several critical events in the life of Jesus. Together, they give us their thoughtful conclusions on Jesus, man, Messiah, or more, on this day of discovery.
We're here in Jerusalem to revisit a decision made by a group of religious leaders in the first century. It was a decision that changed the course of history. I'm standing on what archaeologists tell us is a road that would have been here during the times of Jesus. It's either a Roman or Hasmonean road. It leads from Upper Jerusalem down to the Kidron Valley and then across to the Mount of Olives. As I look at the road, I wonder who would have walked it that eventful night that the gospel accounts tell us about.
Judas, one of the 12, with a great multitude with swords and clubs, came from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. Whomever I kiss, he is the one. Seize him. The Gospel of Mark, chapter 14.
It tells the religious leaders had Jesus arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane. He was led across the Kidron Valley and then to the house of the high priest. There he was examined by religious leaders.
And they led Jesus away to the high priest, and with him were assembled all the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes. The Gospel of Mark, chapter 14.
Now, to many, the accounts of the gospel seems clear enough. But there are scholars, and there are many who question what really happened that night. What were the issues? How did the conversation go? What was Jesus really trying to do? The exact location of the interrogation of Jesus at the house of Israel's high priest is not known. But here in Jerusalem, a church called St. Peter's in Gallicantu was built to remember that event. A life-size bronze sculpture in the courtyard captures the moment when we're told that the disciple Peter denied that he ever knew Jesus.
Another girl saw Peter and said to those who were there, "This fellow also was with Jesus of Nazareth." But again he denied with an oath, "I do not know the man." Then he began to curse and swear, saying, "I do not know the man." Immediately a rooster crowed. And Peter remembered the word of Jesus, who had said to him, "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." So he went out and wept bitterly. The Gospel of Matthew, chapter 26.
It was here in this church courtyard, near the bronze sculpture of Peter denying Jesus, that we met with 3 New Testament scholars. The evening darkness began to match the mood of the night of the betrayal. And then, out of the dusk, a hawk-like bird startled us by flying into the set and landing on one of our crew. In the same moment, the church bell began ringing, and then the Muslim call to prayer. But our concern eased as the bird of prey seemed to settle in for the discussion.
Well, Mark, I know you had short notice, but that is not a rooster that crows.
That's not a rooster.
That is a falcon.
What was so amazing is while we were sitting here, that falcon flew into the set, and we don't have a clue what it is. Is it a trained bird? Is it a young bird?
Yeah, what is this?
We've got all kinds of questions. But actually, we've come to discuss something more important. Another event that a lot of questions have been raised about, not necessarily by those who believe in the New Testament record, but by others, right? But the examination of Jesus.
That's correct. Here is a scene that literally changed history. It is the decision that moved Jesus from the Jewish leadership to the Roman leadership to Pilate. And in that decision, Jesus' fate of crucifixion was sealed.
The Roman Empire occupied Israel at the time of Jesus. Under the authority of Pilate the governor, Roman law was enforced.
Now, you said an examination. Is this a trial or an examination?
It is an examination. They're trying to gather evidence to take to Pilate to say that Jesus is a political threat as far as Rome is concerned. Rome doesn't care at all whether Jesus teaches about religion, or they might care if he disturbs the peace, but if he claims to be a king or to have some type of authority, and Rome didn't have a role in establishing that authority, that they care about.
So this hearing then, the purpose of it was in effect what we might say today, to secure an indictment.
Exactly
in
right.
order to bring a charge
Exactly.
against Jesus that Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, would take very seriously.
Exactly right. And so it is very much like a grand jury investigation or a gathering of evidence or an inquiry into whether they have enough to bother Pilate. The last thing they want to do is to take Jesus to Pilate and for Pilate to say, don't bother me with this guy. It's going to be harder to bring him back if they miss this time. So they've got to get this right.
Many people think of this as a trial, but really it's an examination in a very different way than what we might think of as a trial.
So why isn't it a trial?
It's not a trial because the Jewish authorities do not possess the right to execute anybody. So any judgment they make has to be passed on to somebody else. So what they are doing is they are gathering the evidence so that they can take it to Pilate so that he can make the judgment, since he's the only one who has the authority to put someone to death. And it also accomplishes something. If Pilate puts him to death, the Jewish leaders are not ultimately responsible for Jesus' death. The Roman leadership is. So it also provides a cover. So both of these points are very, very important.
Just a few days prior to the arrest of Jesus, he had gone into the temple and knocked over the tables of the money changers.
And that's why the first charge that comes in is, or the accusation against him is that this man said that he will destroy the temple. So they're reading into his actions in the temple that Jesus has come to destroy it, that he's come in a powerful kind of a way.
Now what's interesting is that Jesus actually did talk about the temple. He talked about the temple being removed in one sense, and then it being replaced. Of course, it's an allusion to his resurrection.
Then some rose up and bore false witness against Jesus, saying, "We heard him say, I will destroy this temple made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another made without hands." But not even then did their testimony agree. The Gospel of Mark, chapter 14.
There's a lot of things that have happened before we ever get here that are kind of setting the table for what's taking place. They try and pin Jesus on the temple charge, because if they can do that, if they can prove that Jesus is disturbing the peace, then Pilate has an obligation to keep the peace.
Okay.
And keep in mind too, the Romans recognized temples of other peoples and other religious faiths. And that's very serious to them. And someone comes in hinting at the possible destruction of a temple, that is very serious. And so I can see why in the examination of Jesus, they began with that.
That would come up.
That would be a good
Exactly.
accusation, because he did criticize the temple.
Right.
He hinted at them losing their position. He foretold the temple's destruction at some point. It's not hard then to make an accusation like that.
Definitely.
Now this effort was not successful because they couldn't get the witnesses to agree.
Now what witnesses?
The witnesses that they were bringing about the temple charge.
Those questioning Jesus were part of the Jewish religious court called the Sanhedrin.
Now this is very, very important, because what it shows is the Sanhedrin understands they've got to make their case to Pilate. They can't go in with a half-cocked case. They've got to really bring the goods, because the worst thing that could happen would be to bring Jesus to Pilate, to have Jesus examined by Pilate, and for Pilate to release him. Okay, because they could never bring him back, or at least it would be very difficult unless Jesus really precipitated something. So they've got to be successful the first time. So they're careful. The temple charge is not going to work. They can't get the witnesses to agree. And so the high priest steps in and asks Jesus a question. Are you the Son of the Blessed One? That's a very carefully worded question. He doesn't say, are you the Son of God? He uses a circumlocution. He speaks around the name of God.
So what's he going for? What's he trying to do?
He's trying to communicate the reverence of the scene, okay? And what's interesting is that when Jesus replies, he replies with equal care. because he says, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power. So he answers the high priest's circumlocution with a circumlocution of his own, talking about God's authority. But then he's going to talk about God as his authority, inviting him to sit at his right hand, and then him riding on the clouds to bring judgment.
Again the high priest asked him, saying to him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" Jesus said, "I am, and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power, and coming with the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, "What further need do we have of witnesses? You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" And they all condemned him to be deserving of death. The Gospel of Mark, chapter 14.
He's doing two things when he makes this claim. He's making a claim of exaltation. God is inviting me to sit permanently at his side and receive me into heaven at his side to share his authority. In the second half, the reference to riding on the clouds is an allusion to judgment authority. I'm going to come back and be a judge, which means that what he's telling the leadership is, you may think I'm on trial here, but one day you will be on trial. So they were not very happy when they heard this.
The two passages that Jesus alludes to in his reply, one of them is from Psalm 110, "Sit at my right hand." The other one is from Daniel 7, where thrones are set up and God sits down and the court convenes in judgment. Both passages speak of judgment. Jesus blends them together in identifying himself. And the implication is the day will come, he will sit in judgment on those who are judging him right now. I'm not surprised at all that the high priest ripped his robes and cried out blasphemy, which in the Jewish mind, that's the worst thing he's done. He's claimed to share God's authority, and not only that, he's going to judge God's representative, the high priest. How dare this man speak this way?
Let me illustrate
From their point of view,
it
he
is.
crossed the line.
He absolutely
committed
crossed the line.
blasphemy.
Absolutely.
So according to the Gospels, Jesus claimed to be the King and Messiah of Israel, and that he would be seated in the very presence of God, put his life in jeopardy. Next, the religious leaders would need to find a way to make their charges a crime worthy of Roman execution. After almost 2,000 years, this group of Orthodox rabbis and religious leaders has once again revived the religious council called the Sanhedrin. For meetings of major importance, the Great Sanhedrin, a group of 71, meets as judges much as they did in the first century. Today, these Orthodox men have no political or civic authority, but they give opinions and write declarations about things like making peace or commenting on various local, national, and international policies. And since they haven't met for 2,000 years, they say they have many issues waiting to be addressed.
The Sanhedrin is on the list about 500 subjects. It's tremendous because 2,000 years no Sanhedrin exists. All the problems remain unhandled. And now we have Sanhedrin, so every problem, cry, please solve the problem. So we have a list of about 500 subjects.
And maybe somewhat ironically, another group, a group of Bible scholars, is also trying to bridge the gap of the last 2,000 years. They're exploring the role of the ancient Sanhedrin in the examination of Jesus the night he was betrayed. But others say the Sanhedrin, this religious Supreme Court, could not have been involved in the examination of Jesus, because to do so, they would have had to break the rules of their own council regarding trials deciding life and death.
One of the issues is that later Mishnah gives certain regulations for what
Jewish
would be-
literature from a
That's
Jewish,
right,
Jewish literature from a later time.
at least 100 years after this, gives certain regulations as to what is a valid trial or examination. In that particular sense, it would be a trial. And there are many scholars that look at this and say they see discrepancies between what Mishnah lays out and what's going on here in the Jewish setting in the first century.
So they're breaking
questioning
their
the-
rules. They're
That's right.
breaking their rules.
And I bet then they're questioning the
I'm
reliability of the biblical
I'm not
text,
impressed
right?
by that argument
That's right.
one bit, because Josephus himself, the first century Jewish historian, tells us that the ruling priest broke rules all the time. And so the idea that you could go to a rabbinic code, an idealized understanding of the law 200 years later and say, hey, they didn't follow those rules. Forget it. They didn't follow those rules. They followed their own rules. And sometimes they broke the rules, their own rules, for expedience. And Jesus was a pest, and they were going to nail him.
And they had only a short time in which they were going to be able to get to Pilate. They didn't want to have to hold on to Jesus for a long time. They were in a special circumstance. And this also is an examination. It's not a capital murder trial, if you will. And so these rules apply to a murder trial. They do not apply necessarily to an examination. So that entire discussion is a rabbit trail. It's a cul-de-sac. Let's come back and get on the main road.
Okay. Are there other issues?
Yeah. There's another objection, and that is, well, the people who cared weren't there. Peter wasn't there. The rest of the disciples weren't there. So there were no Christian, you might say, Christian witnesses. I'm not impressed by that kind of an argument. Well, if there are no Christian witnesses there, how then does a report of the trial get into the Gospels?
How do they know it was said?
Oh, this must be an invention later.
Okay, how do you answer that?
Well, I think the simple answer is that there are many possible strands of getting a hold of this information. You have Nicodemus, you have Joseph of Arimathea. They're a part of the inner circle. They know what's going on. You have the debate that goes on between the church and Judaism as a result of Jesus' crucifixion. You have 30 years of fighting between the family of Annas, of which Caiaphas is a member, and Jesus' family. In fact, one of Caiaphas' descendants and relatives puts James to death, the brother of the Lord. That's 30 years later. So they're bickering 30 years in public over who's got this right. Surely the charge of Jesus and what he was crucified for and what was at stake and what the debate was would have come out in the public discussion. This is the Jerusalem grapevine at work. And we all know that grapevines can work pretty well even when there's an attempt to keep the information secret. But in this case, there would be no need to want to keep the information secret. You'd want it to be publicized because you'd want to know what is going on from your perspective so that people don't react to what you've done. The Sadducees are very nervous about the kind of grasp for authority that Jesus is demonstrating. They want to stop him. The only way they can stop him is to deal with him and deal with him quickly. And if they can get Rome to deal with him, then in the end they have the ultimate trump card. They can say, we didn't put Jesus to death. We took him to Rome, and Rome did it. And we still hear that today.
Okay. One more question then. Someone says, it sounds good. It makes sense. I see what you're doing here. But somebody says, but I'm just not sure. You're three Christian men who have studied the Bible from your perspective. What if I still have questions? What if I just don't have the kind of confidence in the text that you've been able to work through together? What would you say to them?
I think it's really important to put this in the context of Jesus' entire ministry. I mean, all that is coming up in this particular examination, we can find that Jesus has been claiming to be the Messianic coming one. He is going to be the one that is establishing God's kingdom on the earth. So all of these events leading up to this, what the Jewish leaders are doing is just twisting it now. Taking some of those things that they think that they can use to manipulate and get a charge that they can take to the Romans. And then really what ends up happening as well is that when Jesus is taken to Pilate now, Pilate accused him of being the king of the Jews. And this is putting it in the context then for what is happening with the charges by the Jewish leaders fits very well within Jesus' overall earthly ministry.
Let me flip it and talk a little personally. I did not grow up in a Christian home. I did not grow up believing the Bible. In fact, I didn't take the Bible seriously until I was in the middle of college. I didn't begin to take the Bible seriously, even to think about what it said. I thought it was just a bunch of stories. But it was as I began to look at some things that friends were talking to me about and to take a harder look, being curious. I wasn't closed, but I was curious, and I certainly was, the Bible, come on. And as I looked at it more and more, the more sense it made. The more sense it made. And as I've been studying it ever since, in the 30 plus years that I've been doing serious work, and I've spent 20 years on this passage in particular, the more I look at it, the more it makes sense, the more it hangs together, it coheres. And so I think it you can scrutinize it, you can be critical of it, you can take a shot at it, but it stands. It stands the test of the examination. The examination stands the test of the examination.
Okay, but if somebody still says, but I just don't have your faith, what do you say?
Just stay open. I think the main thing is to stay open, to listen to how the thing makes sense. Don't close your mind to the possibility, because what is on the other side of this possibility will be a redefining of what life and existence really is and what it means to be connected to God, to the creation, to life, to understanding life and death. Jesus died not to die. He died to bring life. And these are cosmic questions that are worth our attention and our examination.
And any person that does have these questions, what they need to do is to realize that all of us have had questions. In the same way that Darrell had questions that brought him to faith, I had questions that brought me to faith. And what we are is people that are rooted in history. This isn't just some kind of religious book that you just, quote, take by faith. What you want to do is seriously examine all of the issues in Jesus' life.
And so what Mike is saying is that it makes historical sense. That's what we're all saying. That's what this effort is about. But it also makes personal sense. It helps us to define who we are as people. And if Jesus really is at the right hand of the Father, exercising that authority by the invitation of the Creator, creatures should listen.
You know, there is one other thing that could be said. Right here behind us, there's a statue depicting Peter denying his master. Why would the early church make that up? I mean, there's something embarrassing about the story, because we're talking about the hearing. But while the hearing is going on, while Jesus is inside being interrogated, there's Peter outside being intimidated by a woman. And in Jewish society, this servant girl has the lowest status. And there's Peter, the great apostle, the spokesman for the church. And he's making a fool of himself. He's denying his master. This is not the stuff of pious imagination. This is raw-boned history. It's dirty. It's just the way it is. And that gives me a lot of confidence. These are not fairy tales. This is just the naked truth. This is just telling what happened, even if it makes some people, heroes later, look kind of bad.
And even more interesting is someone like Josephus, who's a first century Jewish historian, says that Jesus was crucified by Pontius Pilate at the instigation of the leadership. So the basic storyline here is corroborated outside the Bible. I often get the question, well, you're just saying this because it's in the Bible. And I go, no, it's not just in the Bible. This story is much bigger, and it did make, if you will, the Jerusalem Times.
Whenever I visited the courtyard of the church at St. Peter's, I found myself drawn to that bronze statue of Peter denying Jesus. I feel for him when I reflect on the emotions of fear and anger that must have been such a part of Jesus' arrest, the betrayal, the accusations that marked his examination. The fact that the Gospels even record Peter's denial is pretty amazing. Peter was one of the most influential of Jesus' disciples. How embarrassing that he cursed and denied that he even knew him. And yet, even that denial happened in a way that brings together one more strand of so many reasons to see that the gospel accounts resonate not only with the land, life, and times of the New Testament, but with the kind of emotions and decisions that all of us have to make about whether the one who was examined and condemned that night was ultimately condemned and crucified for us.